Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter of the second book of Chronicles. Because there is no antecedent narrative context to establish, we're going to follow the customary who, what, when, where, why formula. The who, the author, is nowhere identified in the text, nor indeed anywhere else, but according to Jewish scribal tradition, Ezra, the same author who not only wrote the book which bears his name, and Nehemiah, which were originally combined and consolidated into a single book, but Nehemiah was a man of action. He was a builder. He was not a writer. Ezra was a scribe and a priest and a historian. So the category to which this book belongs it's an Old Testament history. It is included in the tail end of before Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So it's a post-exilic history of a pre-exilic people. So that audience is the when. It is a post-exilic people, more specifically the denizens of Judah. So there is no mention of the northern kings as there are in a lot of the pre-exilic writings that are referenced, which add to an enriching layer in historical tapestry. This book relies heavily on the Pentateuch and also the Samuels and the Kings, and the evidence suggests that the Kings influenced this book above and beyond anything. So there's no visible or exertable impact in the text of it's clearly communicated that the former came before the latter. So this is a later, which relies heavily on it, but it is also categorized in addition to our categorization of historical, the Old Testament, the way that the Jews originally arranged it. We arranged ours in Pentateuch, history, prophecy, writings, then prophecy. They arranged theirs in laws, prophecies, and writings. So the Chronicles, the second Chronicles, would have been at the tail end of the Jewish Old Testament, right before the New Testament, Matthew. And this is because the promise was invested in Judah, the tribe of Judah. This promise was given as early as 49:10 in Genesis, but that we will receive some expansions on that promise and details in about the Davidic. It's also promised to be a descendant of David, so it's through his loins that this promised one will come. And the messianic promise is what motivates, in the engine, which motivates a people who were recently returned from exiles. They are still subjected to a more benign master of the Persians, but they have no nation to call their own, no autonomous government or walls or protections or anything else like that. So what are they? But they have the promise, which was recorded in the first Chronicles, that David is promised a dynasty in perpetuity. He had about 20 descendants who fulfilled his throne, who refilled his throne in Jerusalem all the way to 586, when Zedekiah, the final one, was removed, and I believe he had his eyes gouged out. But the Chronicles account is very much a whitewashing compared to the earlier historical books, the Samuels and the Kings. So there is no mention of how Solomon was born, how David met his mother, his great outstanding sin when he seduced her, impregnated her, and killed her husband to protect conceal the crime. And the firstborn was born a stillborn from them, but then Solomon came, and his name can either translate as peace and quiet, or also replacement. Peace, shalom, and menuka, quiet, peace and quiet, the prefix and suffix respectively. But also nowhere mentioned is the power struggle. David's sin is mentioned in conducting the census. This is the 24th chapter of 2 Samuel, but that is part of the connected to the path to build the temple, and then from there he publicly coronates his son and successor Solomon. There is none of the public struggle. So what happened is that an elder claimant tried to usurp the throne before David's death. This was Adoniah. He was the eldest son of David, but the customary practice would be for a king to give it to the eldest son of their favorite wife, and that woman was Bathsheba for David. So like brother, his older brother Absalom himself tried to usurp the throne from David. There is no mention of that in the Chronicles account. So it presents a whitewashing. It looks back to a golden age, which the reigns of David and Solomon were by any objective measure. At any other state of their history, there was just this prosperity and the force to be reckoned with, and they were flourishing as they never had, but they were still men prone to sin. And Solomon's sin is, he's presented this king as an effortless inheritance, but also it does not mention his. The book concludes with the audience and the Queen of Sheba. And then there's no equivalent of the 11th chapter of Kings. Solomon ultimately succumbed to idolatry, but the Chronicle accounts does accurately record which of the successors of Solomon and David were reformers and which were idolaters. So the promise of which the idealized figures and portraits of David and Solomon point to is alive, and he's going to be the one who is born from eternity. And from the writings of the prophet Micah 5:2, we know that he's born in Bethlehem, the same town as David was. And then Matthew 2:6 is the fulfillment of that. But first chapter, 2 Chronicles. And Solomon, son of David, strengthened himself over his kingdom, and Yahweh his Elohim was with him, and made him exceedingly great. Solomon was a son of David. He was not the only son. David had polygamous marriages. He had multiple wives and sons by each one. They are listed in the first book of Chronicles, the sons he had at Hebron, where he ruled before he consolidated his control in Jerusalem. But Solomon's strengthening himself over his reign, omitted from this account, is the power struggle from the rival claimant, which had to be sourced. Now, David was lax in disciplining his son. That's why he loved Absalom too much, and Absalom just tried to take what wasn't his, and the same thing happened. But in this account, it is presented as a public coronation. Now, one of these has to be fiction, and because the king's account shows the warts and all, that's the one I'm going to go with. But there is still truth and profound truth conveyed in this fictional whitewashing. But the secret to his strength and the secret to his success and the secret to his wisdom and the secret to his wealth and everything he is and was Yahweh his Elohim. So Solomon was the personification of the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king before that ideal was even an idea. And Solomon spoke to all Israel, and the commanders to the thousands and the hundreds, to the judges, and to every leader in Israel, the heads of the fathers. Solomon was a king, but here he performs a priestly function because the location is eventually given as Gibeon, which was the site and center of the tabernacle. This would have been the capital, central location of worship. But all of Israel there, anyone who's anyone, the military, and all the judges and all the tribal leaders and the heads of the fathers. So there were clans within the tribes and the prominent ones. Everyone who was anywhere would have been there at this public occasion where he performs a priestly function of sacrificing, mass slaughtering. And Solomon and all the assembly with him went at the high place that was at Gibeon, for Elohim's tent of appointment was there, which Moses the servant of Yahweh had made in the wilderness. Solomon, as long as anyone who was anyone, the assembly that was with him, they must have went about 6 miles to the northeast. That was the location of Gibeon to Jerusalem, and that would have been the site of the tabernacle, which was originally constructed in the desert by Moses, and it had been portable. It was a tent, but it was not a house and was not a structure. And even though after the wilderness wanderings, the nation of Israel had ceased to be a nomadic nation on the move, they had houses of their own. And one day David is looking at his own magnificent house of cedar and splendor, and he questions why the Ark of the Covenant and the tent, why it is still in a tent and not a building, at least as magnificent as his own. But Moses was not the one who made it. He is the one who was given the revelation for the information on the design to the tabernacle. That takes place in the 25th through the 31st chapter of Exodus. It's almost a blissful interlude because by the time we reach the 32nd chapter, they succumb to idolatry and their impatience. He was up there 40 days fasting, receiving this flawless blueprint for this architectural gem. But he is credited as the one who made it because he was the one to whom was given the revelation. The identity of the architect is one who was imparted with a spirit of wisdom. I know I'm not going to say his name correctly, but it is Obizel or something. But he does have a name, and he is the architect, but Moses is credited here as the one who made it. However, David had brought up the Ark of Elohim from Kiriath to the place David had prepared for it, for they had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. So this David, the entire purpose for which he captured Jerusalem and made it his capital city was to have the political capital and the worship center united and consolidated and combined as one. So as a monarchy developed, eventually there grew to be a capital city, and Jerusalem was the ideal one for its central location. It didn't have a river running through it, but it was secure in hills and mountains, and it was certainly sustainable for a large population. And that is the place where he was to give the Ark of the Covenant rest. So the Ark of the Covenant in the tent had had a restless existence since the days of Moses. One of the things that he wanted to do was to bring it rest. So he did bring it to Jerusalem. He did recover it from the hands of the Philistines, I believe, earlier. So the rocky existence of this Ark was such that it was never in one place and never theirs for long until David brought it rest in Jerusalem. And the bronze altar that Belshazzar, son of Uri, son of Hur, had made, and he put the temple of Yahweh, and Solomon in the assembly sought it. So this architect of the bronze altar is recognizable from the Exodus. Solomon did employ an architect from Tyre in part of the commercial exchange, which was conducted between him and King Hiram, who was older than Solomon but younger than David. He was a friend to both and instrumental in the commercial transactions which enabled the building of this temple. They're all seeking it. This was the purpose for which he was born. This was his destiny to be the one. So David was promised. There are three things that God can say to you in prayer. One is yes, the other is no, and the other is not yet. So this was just a not yet promise. David had the promise that his son would build the temple that he would not see, that was in his heart to build for reasons both priestly, his body, and utilitarianly, the distraction of fighting for the empire's security in the borders. And he was already priestly, ceremonially defiled for reasons we earlier explained. And Solomon went up there to bronze altar before Yahweh, which was at the tent of appointments, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. This he did spare no expense and spared no animals. He meant business. This was a sacrificial slaughtering sufficient to procure the atonement of the entire nation, even though there was more than 1,000 people. By this time they had become a nation as numerous as the sands on the seashore. But he's at the tent of the appointment. This is the central location. This is where the ark and the magnificently adorned bronze altar, which was designed by Belshazzar, son of Uri, son of Hur, would have been there, and that would have been the location where he's offering these multitudinous burnt offerings. So there was animals involved, and he did not spare any life. This would have been a bloody occasion. We talk about the blood-soaked religions before Christianity. This is a significant occasion, so it demanded a significant amount of sacrifice. This was a solemn occasion and no ordinary one, and the nation had to be as clean as they were able, even though there were more than 1,000 sinners in them. 1,000 would have to do. That night Elohim appeared to Solomon and said to him, "Ask what I should give you." The word appeared in the Hebrew original has luminous connotation, so we do read that there is a visible element in the appearance, but we are not privy to any visual description. What we read is the verbal contents that is exchanged. So in our analysis of dreams, we witness prior to Joseph is the first one whose dreams have symbolism. There are visible elements which connect, and in Daniel we see symbolism on steroids, but the theophanic manifestation in the dream, because it's at night, so this was his revelation to him, was exclusively verbal. And what he's giving him here is a blank check, blank slate for anything he desires. And our desires reveal our characters. It also reveals how we envision our life's goal. So Solomon did not suffer from any confusion about the reason he was born and the reason he was reigning. He knew that he would be the one to build the temple, but the problem is he recognized his own deficiency in wisdom to complete the task, he being youth and inexperienced. So this was his most pressing need, and he was wise to act so. So it would be an oversimplification that there was no wisdom in Solomon prior to this point. We witnessed that David prayed for his wise and obedient and faithful heart in the 22nd and 28th and chapter of First Chronicles. But and Solomon said to Elohim, "You have shown great kindness to David, my father, and have made me king in his place." David was a man after God's own heart, and he may have been if Israel was the apple of his eye, he was the man who was leading it. He was the one most closely connected. He was a friend of Yahweh in ways that Solomon, I hate to say it, was not. But, David survives as the model monarch, but Solomon has all the right faith to begin with, but he does eventually forsake it towards its tail end. He succumbs to idolatry and premature death because one of the promises that is given here, not given here, but given in the King's account, the 3rd chapter, is the promise for longevity of life. This alone is conditional of the promises. The ones we read of in this chapter are unconditional unanimously. Now Yahweh Elohim, let your promise to David my father stand fast, for you have appointed me to reign over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth. Solomon is aware of the greatness of his task, the greatness of his people, and the greatness of his God, and he is looking inwardly and introspectively and overwhelmed with the awareness of his own inadequacies. So he knows that this task, the reason he was born, is something bigger than himself. Therefore, the same power that enabled David to rise from the sheep pen to the throne would keep and sustain Solomon there. So that is part of the nature of his prayer. So his awareness of his own limitations, his own insignificance, is what's getting him to pray what he does. Now give me the wisdom and knowledge so that I go out and come in before this people, for who rightly rules this great people of yours? Wisdom and knowledge. Now, ancient monarchs would have relied on a slew of wise men. These were men who had wisdom, a precious commodity that kings would have paid for. But Solomon did not ask to be surrounded by advisors. He asked by wise men. He asked for the wisdom to himself. And Solomon does recognize the value in the multitude of counselors, as is indicated in the book of Proverbs, but he still had to have the wisdom to act on their counsel and act on their information. So we prayed for the wisdom and the knowledge. Now, wisdom is not some abstract, esoteric, impersonal force. There is no wisdom that exists apart from people. It is an intensely personal force, and wisdom enables us to navigate our ways through life. And the knowledge is more the practical prudence that are necessary for the utilitarian and perfunctory duties and obligations of kingdom maintenance. So he wanted to rule justly, and that was one of his things. And immediately now, in the king's account, we witness an evidence of this ruler, his justice in action and a manifestation of his wisdom, whereby he discerns the authentic mother of two prostitutes, both of whom are claiming the same child, and the phony mother, the one who slept on her own kid and then stole the one, agreed when he offered to cut them in half. She agreed to it, but the real mother would rather have the baby survive and be given to her. And the people are just astounded by this wisdom. But the fact that he is given the wisdom to rule is implied, even though we don't have a specific concrete example of his judicial genius in action, as we do in Kings. But once more, he's just aware of the greatness of the task, the greatness of the people, the greatness of the nation, and he himself feels inadequate because he is but a mere boy, a mere lad of 19 years old, entrusted with this awful responsibility. He was a precocious youth, but he would have been immature. But he managed to complete the task by the time he was 30 years old. So this is proof of the promise. And much of Chronicles is devoted to the construction of the temple. The 2nd to the 7th chapter just describes it in detail. But the wisdom is foundational to the actual building, the wisdom that he received in response to a request, and we can ask the same thing. James 1:5, if any of you stand in need in wisdom, ask in faith, and he will give liberally, and just without any inhibition. So it is commensurate and consistent with the will of God that we need to be wise. Solomon recognized the need for the wisdom for what he needed to do. So the question we need to ask ourselves before we pray for wisdom is specifically, what do we need the wisdom to do? But that is one of those prayers: knock and it shall be opened, ask and you shall find, and seek and you shall find, and ask and you shall receive. And Elohim said to Solomon, because this was in your heart, and you have not asked riches or wealth or esteem or the life of your enemies, nor have you asked long life, but have asked wisdom and knowledge for yourself, so as to rightly rule my people over whom I have appointed you to reign. Elohim approves of Solomon's priorities. He recognizes that his most urgent request, his one desire, his greatest urge, his greatest inclination, which emanates from his heart, was the right one. So had he asked for riches, he would have been vain, self-centered in pursuit. But he got it anyway as a consequence to the righteousness of his response to this question. So pleased was God with what Solomon asked for, that he gave him what he did not ask for. He gave him wealth and esteem. And the life of the enemies, that is not something he would have to need to pray for, because in the king's account, I believe Adonijah is already killed, and that is how Solomon is secure and his power consolidated on his throne. But, he was not a military man, so he did not have the enemies in quite the same way, the literal way, the physical way that his father David did. But he did not ask long life, but the condition on that is ultimately deprived. But he asked for the right things: wisdom and knowledge to rule correctly, rule rightly, to take his God-appointed responsibility seriously, and to rule with gravity and justice and wisdom, and to rule in a manner that honors God and gives a witness and testimony to the nation surrounding it. Here is this great king in whom the wisdom of God dwells, and look how great his people are. Wisdom and knowledge are given to you, and riches and wealth are in esteem I give, such as none of the kings have had before you, nor have any after you. Wisdom and knowledge, these are righteous requests, one that he will instantly and automatically accommodate in a similar scenario were we in. So once we narrow down the specifics of precisely what task we need the wisdom and knowledge for, they'll be given to us when he asks. Riches and wealth, this is something he got incidentally. He did not desire this above all else, but he came to accumulate vast treasures, gold poured in like silver, so much so that silver was devalued in the reign of Solomon. Oh, nothing but gold. He had 300 gold shields in his throne room, his magnificent throne room, which were captured by the Egyptian invaders during the reign of Rehoboam, who subsequently replaced them with bronze. But gold was abundant in the reign of Solomon, and the archaeological evidence suggests that the accounts of the annual influx of gold in the king's account are not exaggerated. But this wealth and wisdom is going to be unprecedented and unduplicated before any who have come before you, nor any after you. So there's a preeminence over the past, and also a preeminence over the future. So Solomon was very much the unique beneficiary of God's grace. And Solomon went to Jerusalem from the high place that was at Gibeon, from before the tent of appointment, and reigned over Israel. He has his priorities satisfied in order. Before he reigns, he goes and submits and sacrifices and performs the priestly task of ruling a covenant nation. So his father David often addressed assemblies in public, and that is one of the things. Solomon personally leads the worship and sacrificial service. He would have given the prayer at the dedicatory temple, but this place was at Gibeon, remember, 6 miles to the northeast, and before the tent of appointment, the prime of locations in the tabernacle. And once he does that, he's set to rule and reign, and his power is firmly established. So what happens, what unfolds, is peace and prosperity to unprecedented and unduplicated extents. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. The location of these horses are earlier given in 16th. So it's interesting, the detail that the king's account offers is that Solomon sometimes sacrificed in local places. In other words, he took what belonged in the central location to shrines and localities. But here he's turning to Egypt. We haven't really got quite there yet. But the point is that this peace was a peace by strength. He had military might, and certainly, he was not so pacifistic. And he did eventually run into trouble, so it would have been helpful to have this army was more than mere vanity. It would have been highly useful and effective in maintaining peace or prosperity. But this is a personal, private cavalry of 400 chariots. And the king made silver and gold to be as stone in Jerusalem, and he made cedars to be as plenty as sycamores, which are in the low country. Silver diminished in value by the time he got the economic mechanics in motion. Gold flowed in abundantly and without reserve and without limit. But silver still poured in. Like stones in Jerusalem, there's just an overwhelming abundance of their overflow. And cedars, these are the prized possession of Lebanon, the neighbor to the north. David lived in a palace of cedar, and much of the temple would have been adorned in cedar. This unique and rare wood came from Lebanon, the nation to the north, and the sycamores, they grow. They are native in the low country, the southern part of the kingdom where Judah, the territorial tribe, would have been located. But so efficient was his commercial contacts with Hiram in the north that all these things became more plentiful than the native indigenous trees there. And Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and from Q. The king's merchants brought them in Q at a price. Solomon performed as a middleman or intermediary between a trade between Egypt and the kings to the north. His advantaged location to the north of Egypt, made him privileged to this. But in some sense, even though he benefited from the trade, it was a violation, because to look back in Egypt was to look back to the world, to look back to the slave existence, to look back to idolatry and everything else. So from a strictly ethical direction, as established in Deuteronomy, this would have been a violation and a deviation of the commandments there. And but he did profit financially as a result of this arrangement. And they came up and brought from Egypt a chariot for 600 pieces of silver, and a horse for 150. And so all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram, they brought them out by their hand. So the exact amount, 600 pieces. We don't have any modern calculator that measures out what the pieces are, but this is the going rate, and this is the price, and this is the detailed information of the economic transaction as it transpired in history. These would have been the set prices between Solomon and the Hittites. They were a nation to the north. They were part of the original inhabitants in Canaan, but they originally hailed from Turkey, the country. Asia Minor, as it would have been known in New Testament times. But Aram was also to Syria from the north, so Solomon benefited by his geographical intermediary position between Egypt and Syria to profit from the best horses which were found in Egypt. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. What comes after this is really just chapters 2 through 7 are just about the temple construction, and we've done some of those, and we might do them soon. But that's all we have for the time for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.